talking about sleighs, sleds, and sledges. My name is Kathleen Hake, and in the SCA, I go by Lady Kathleen Redrider. Just a little bit of background, been in horses all my life. I currently have a Carriage Association of America Level 2 driver proficiency. Been fortunate enough to win a couple of national championships in pleasure driving, and also to represent our breed at the World Equestrian Games in 2010. My current day job is with the Carriage Association of America, which means that I literally do carriages all day long for work. So it's been really exciting researching. Typically, I deal with stuff after the 1800s, and so to go back and look at some things a little bit older is quite interesting. Now, one of the things you might have noticed is that there is a problem with this title. Any guesses? Yes, indeed. It is the word sleigh. Sleighs really didn't come into, the word sleigh didn't really come into being until 1703. It is very much an American word. And although it is Dutch in origin, it's typically used here in the United States. And the word cutter, which is the other word that we hear here in America, didn't come into being until the 1800s. So we're not normally talking about them when we talk about sleighs in the medieval periods or sledges. So the word that they use in Europe, particularly for this time period, is sledges. Sometimes you will also see sleds. Either one works, but most often sledges. It's the one that museums use most often. And that is important when it comes time to talk about research. So what is a sledge? Well, that very much depends on what time period you're talking about. So here we have three very, very different looking sledges. The first one on the top is actually a sledge that was used in Egypt. And we, as humans, determined very early on that if we could hook something to a horse, it was easier to move, or if we could just put it on something to slide it. We could use human power, dog power, reindeer power. If it had feet, we tried to use it to move it. So we know that these type of things were available very early on. There's numerous examples of this, and people got very smart very early on. They would use water to freeze where they wanted to take the sledges to make them easier to move. They would use sledges when it wasn't winter. Because if you think right now, we're kind of getting into spring and the frost is coming out of the ground and all these potholes are showing up in our roads, and where the horses are is all dimply right now. Would you rather go over that in a sled or with a set of wheels? Particularly if you were old or injured. The answer is probably that you would prefer a smoother ride with a sledge. And so that is something that happens a lot in colder areas of the world during this time period. Russia, Germany, Sweden, Norway, Austria, all types of places. And even into France, you see these being used for that type of purpose, just because it's much smoother and much more practical. We do here in the middle for B, this is a parade sledge. And basically this is a paper mache type dragon that has been put on this sled. And they just dragged it in a parade. On the far side, we see a ceremonial sledge from Russia, St. Petersburg, which is actually 1760. And you can see they're still calling it the same thing, and it still slides over the snow and ice. So regardless of what time period you're talking about, if you're talking European, it's probably a sledge. I did decide that ultimately we had a lot of material to cover, so I didn't go into the sled and the sled cars very much. They are very much like a Travis that the American Indians used, and which might give you an idea of what that might look like. And there's a whole topic there. So previously, people had talked about the Osenberg find. We often talk about the wheeled vehicle, but we don't often talk about the sledges. There are 4 sledges that were found. They were used with a pair of horses attached to a single shaft, and that shaft attached here. And that's really important because for a long time we lose this technology. And we'll look at some different things in a few minutes, but this is a very, very early example of a pair of horses being attached to a sledge. And then we don't see it again for a long, long time. 3 of these were highly carved, which you can see an example of on the one side, and then the other was for agricultural use. The important thing about these is that they're not much different than what we use today. The darker section of the runners here is wood that could be replaced. This is a more permanent runner. And this whole piece here is one piece. This piece that's on the top, this bed here, is just lashed on. And so it could be removed, which is very similar to how we have undercarriage of vehicles, carriages, and sleds that we use today. So we've kept the same basic design, this idea, for quite a long time. It's very practical. So Samuel, who's a Dutch merchant, tells us how in the year, hold on, I'm sorry, I gotta move this. So he tells us how in the year 1586, he traveled from Stockholm in the company of a woman from the Netherlands. It is strange to see how women are conveyed in the wintertime. The sledges are specifically made so the women can lie down and be completely covered over, with the exception of the face. The sledges are then covered with sheepskins, which are tied down, and the traveler lies like a child in its cradle. So you have a very secured, whether it's a person or a packages or supplies, that's very secure on the actual vehicle itself. And then whoever is driving, for the most part at this point in time, is standing or partially sitting. And part of the reason why is because it's harder to fall asleep, and you also stay slightly warmer that way. So in 1520 in Augsburg, Germany, there was a young man who was an accountant. His name was Matthias Schwarz, and he was a fashion gentleman. He really enjoyed it, and he decided that he was going to hire artists to paint him in watercolor. And he launched a project he called the Little Book of Clothes. And he maintained this book until he was 63. You can see some really nice things here. Remember earlier we were talking about line of draft. We've got a pretty nice line of draft. It's a little tight, but not too bad. And line for the lines is pretty straight too. Now you may be wondering what's happening on this slide. I have a little bit of trouble correctly identifying what to call this sled, it's a sledge, because they're often called by whatever they're decorated with. So it may be the lion sledge or something like that throughout history. This particular one, I think, is a box sledge. But you can see the gentleman, Mr. Schwarz, standing, kind of sitting on the back. The black thing is actually his sword. We see a different picture of him in a minute, and so you'll be able to see the sword. You can see he does have a whip with him, but it's in the actual sledge. And this big divider here, and kind of wondering, well, why is that there? There's a couple of reasons. One is that it blocks the wind, which is important back then. And then it was also richly decorated. And if you look at the side of this sledge, you'll notice that there are dogs jumping through hoops. And so it was some type of entertainment on the side. And it's very red. So in 1521, we know that there was a lot of snow and in Augsburg. And in this particular graphic, we can understand that he broke the sled because the horse shied. and that sledging was one of his hobbies. So again, we have this really nice line coming back from the horse to the Matthias's hands. And again, we have a line of draft to his collar that's very nice. The thing that you'll note is on this collar, there appears to be a set of horns, and that was pretty normal back then to have richly decorated collars. And we'll look at some more in just a little bit, but that was something that was fairly common. And you can see again the nice detail. This particular sledge has just some inlay on it, flower inlay, and a portrait of someone for the divider there. So again, very nice. This is all from the same book. Again, very nice lines. We see that on this one, we actually see the horse's face. If I'm understanding the translation right, the bells by the jowls of the horse are called Jester Bells, and would have been similar to the bells that a jester would have worn around the collar on his outfit to entertain. And so again, nice lines. This one we can see the sword. And the thing about this particular one, I think that on the back of this horse's shoes, I just want to make sure. That actually, I'm sorry, it's this one here, this gray one. This is the one you can see the caulks in his shoes. So they're beginning to figure out traction and how to make sure that your horse can properly be able to move on the ground. The first photo that we looked at did not have any shoes at all. We can tell how this one is potentially nailed on by the looking at the hoof right here. So again, we have this nice line. Nothing complicated in this bit at all. We would probably prefer to have, blinkers and maybe a noseband or something on there. But one of the things we have to understand is these horses weren't standing around. They were doing their jobs on a daily basis and putting in some serious miles. So they weren't really worried about being too silly. However, like we noted before, he did occasionally break a sleigh shaft. This is our final image of him. And this is, again, one of those images that is great on multiple formats. We see a lot of bells, so we know things are happening there. We see this really richly blue sleigh, and this is a flax dance painted on the vehicle. And then again, we have this really beautiful outfit that he's wearing. He was very fashion conscious and was really into this type of thing. And it's great that at 26, he had the presence of mind to say that he needed to record this. Now, as I understand it, I'm not quite sure exactly how they work, but these curved runners in the front apparently were able to flex, and they seem to have acted somewhat as a braking turning mechanism. I have requested, I'm trying to find, there is a book that was printed very early on that has some descriptions of how this worked. I've not been able to find it digitally yet, but I'm still looking. And that will help us know a little bit more about how these worked. The base of the vehicle was normally crafted by a journeyman, and then the angle on that runner was crafted by a master craftsman. So. And then we see this sleigh continue on. This again is in Germany, and this is one of those little details of life that pops up in this great big painting that's on the right-hand side. You're probably going, it's kind of like a Where's Waldo? And it's right here is where this, I caught the horse first, and then I found the sleigh. So you can see in this one how having a passenger in the vehicle, this would have blocked the wind coming at them. And this sled is also a little bit bigger. So the 1558. I did want to share this one. We can't see the horse and sled very well, but you can see the correlation in shape between the boats and the sledge. Now, as Donna was saying earlier, there is often some correlation between boat builders and carriage builders, and that happened right up through the 1900s when the whaling industry tapered off and they stopped building a lot of ships. Some of those gentlemen had the same skills that were needed for carriage building, and so they moved over to carriage building because you can see that there's some relationships there. However, we use glue in a different manner, which I think Donna highlighted. But there was definitely some skill overlap. And so if boats, if everybody had enough boats, you could switch over and make some carriages and things like that. It was not unusual. This is technically 1625, a little late, but I did want to take just a moment to highlight, hey, this is a beautiful horse, and this collar is fantastic. But you can see here, this horse has ice calks not only on the toe, but also on the heel. And the artist took the time to make that impression back here. So you can see that that's not paint that dripped, is an actual caulk, and that it was important enough to him to put the horse's hoof prints into the ice. So you can just kind of see how this vehicle has altered over the years. This painting is right on the cusp of being outside of our range, but I did want to talk about it for just a moment. This is a very, very practical scene. These are sledges being used to haul transportation. It is cold enough, obviously, that they're skaters out on the river or the stream, but yet there's no snow. These things, they slide over anything that's grass, dirt. They're equal opportunity in that regards. So we have this George, who was the arranger of festivities at the Saxon court. And although I haven't been able to read it yet, we do know that they were using these different sled designs in 1587. So we're going to talk about a few that are just on the cusp of being out, with the idea that they're very similar to what he was working with in 1587. And in general, these frames are made with linden wood, which is related to basswood, as I understand it. And the bottom of the boxes were mostly consistent of pine and spruce. So we know that in 1590, the Duke Christian of Saxony received a Bergwick from his wife for Christmas, a magnificent sledge with a group of rocks and wild animals. The ships with several masts, sails, and ropes were also used. In addition to wood carvings, the material used were wax, real hair, sewn garments embroidered with precious stones and gold and silver threads. And so the vehicle was not too heavy with lots of paper mache. Even if the nobility could afford more than one splendid sleigh, maintenance and work and repairs were also necessary in the summer months. This is partially due to the fragile material, which is also why they haven't survived, and partially to the level of skill to the handlers. There were frequently accidents due to fast driving, loss of control due to alcohol, or due to horses running through. In Nuremberg, they did have the requirements for bells ringing, and it was very popular for a while to put torches on the sledges. And at one point, they had to ban the students from sledging in one part of the town because they were so populated there that they were in danger of burning down the town. We do see in Germany fairly early on some rules regarding who could or couldn't drive sleighs and different things like that. I'm still working on getting that translation, but I do think it's very interesting that you start seeing these type of controls. You pretty much have to, most of the things that we know about carriage and building and that type of thing around this period of time comes because of laws. There's a 1603 book that is not digitalized yet, that is one of the very first that has survived about how to make sleighs, but it's very hard to know. So you have to go through oodles and oodles of laws to find out, about the bells and the lighting, and like with wheels, what type of wheels were acceptable, how much traction they were allowed to have, who was allowed to drive them. As we get into the outside of SCA period and into the 1700s, they do get into society rules, which is controls who your coachmen are and those type of things. But we're not going to get into that today. So Giuseppe, he is the great grandfather of Surrealism. And you may be thinking, sounds vaguely familiar. If you look down in this right-hand corner, you will see this picture of this gentleman that from a little glance looks okay, but when you look a little closer, he is made of fruits and vegetables. That's the Giuseppe. In 1585, he was hired for the Habsburg court in Vienna, Austria, and he later was with Maximilian II in Prague. And he designed all these carriages. We're not 100% sure what all was built, but we do know that some of them at least were built. And so we're going to take a look at them. He also has this really lovely barding. And it's one of the most detailed sleigh bardings that you can look at from the actual drawings. And again, we have these lovely bells. These are very high quality fabrics that are being used. Lots of great things, silks and things like that. You really wanted to be seen. And so these were very bright and colorful. The horses wore a decorated collar, valuable saddlecloths with bells ringing, feather ornaments on the head, ribbons in its mane. The harness was sometimes so lavish that hardly anything of the horses could be seen. And basically, these were a way to show how much money you had. Now, there are times throughout this entire period where, particularly early on, there's not as much decoration, and that comes down to morality. There was some kickback from the church about being too ostentatious and things like that, but there was so much silver and gold on some of these sleighs, particularly at the end of SCA time and going into the 1700s and early 1800s, that they were sleighing at night because it just glittered and the horses just glittered, and it was amazing a sight, apparently. But moving on, I love this design. I think this would look lovely in a blue velvet with silver bells. So someday I shall make it. And so you can see the designs are just beautiful. He has this wonderful way of just using curves to emphasize everything. You don't see a lot of curves in the sleighs and sledges at this period of time. It's still hard to a certain extent to make those type of things. In the United States now, we see a lot of Albany sleighs with that lovely curved dash, and they really didn't have that then. Another design, and the horse's head lacks a little something, but the rest of it is absolutely beautiful. And again, this is a nice big padded collar, and it would have had decorations. A lot of times they were animal horns, different things. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. We had looked at some of the knights' tournament horses and tournament armor and that type of thing, parade armor, that had decoration by the tail that were like fish and different dragons and different things, so that the mouths opened up and then the tail would come flowing through. And I'm not quite sure if that's what's intended back here at the back or if that's something else, but it's quite interesting to see. I would love to actually be able to do something like that. So moving on, this is one of the sleighs that he designed. As a woodworker, I think this has got to be an amazing, amazing thing to be able to create. The scales, you can see the fish coming into his motif here. And you can see this is where you kind of half stand, half sit on the back. Depends a little bit on how tall you are. And the runners are not long in the back, they're long in the front, which helps with the maneuverability and being able to stop them. So again, this one is like basket weaving. I've not been able to determine yet if this was a wicker or if it was carved wood. Either way, it's a beautiful thing. This is called the sleigh with, I think they're punji, but which is basically cupids. This was a very common thing. I'm not really sure that this one ever got made because I look at it and I think, well, where's the passenger going to be at? And I guess you would be sat down in between all these little cupids. So these people did go out sometimes in masks. It was very much a festival view. There's documentation. There's a book called The Life in Old Florence, where they talk about in 1604 this being like a festival day. Beneath the arches, there were 12 gaudy trumpeters, followed by a crowd of men, and they ran all over the place. And they had these gentlemen on sledges who then did some activities. And they were celebrating different wars and things like this. This is supposed to be a victory type thing. You can see in the front the sword and the shields, so celebrating a victory. But you can at least see where somebody would sit in this one. So that brings us to the tournament, or the album of tournaments and parades in Nuremberg. Now, I had originally thought that this was much, much older than it actually is. And we're going to take a little bit of time to go through some information that was in the early bulletin of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in June 1922. The author is Dashford Dean, and he talks quite a bit about the workmanship of the paintings and how nice they are. So in this particular one, we can see the antlers. The antlers are a recurring theme throughout this time period where they were putting things on the hames. And it's just has to do with being the nobility of the stag and being able to go out and run and be free and all that type of stuff. There's a lot of symbolism here. You note the tail is wrapped up. It is not a cut tail at all. So this here is where we're going to come in. And I'm going to read this directly from the bulletin of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The third section of the work represents personage of an earlier date, roundly 1540 to 1550. Here mounted knights follow each other in splendid color, richly blazoned. In all, 64 are shown and their names appear above their portraits. The final section of the book presents a pageantry of sleighs which took place in Nuremberg probably in the very last years of the 16th century. This follows from a study of the costumes and from the date of 1597 that is borne on the sledge shown on plate 118. This section of the book will be to many the most important documentation of the social conditions and the wealth of the imperial city. One may see, for instance, at a street corner, which is this drawing, a group of civic worthies arranged as judges for the prize of the pageantry. A highly ornate sledge makes the turn in front of them. An intimate note is here provided by street urchins and a barking dog who are celebrating each in its own manner. An inscription states that this fair took place in Nuremberg and was complete in the hour of 2 was struck by the great bell. The number of year has been lost. The contest for the prizes included not only the native Nurembergers, but were also Australian excellencies with their young lady friends, whose scanty costume makes one wonder whether they survived the sleigh ride. So apparently the women were quite lightly dressed. The pageant also include marvelous sledges. There are groups symbolizing the North Sea, pre-Roman world, the Roman Empire, constant love, death, who is the last one coming through and apparently terminates the festival, appearing as a skeleton and driving a bony horse. There were many theological creatures, especially fashionable in those days: Apollo, Neptune, Trion, Diana and Acton, Io and Argus, to say nothing of the others. Other groups were hits on local sports and fads. Stag hunting, two gentlemen in a tub, both blue with cold but playing cards doggedly. And there were finally satirically dressed sledges when with their figures were so dressed that their right side was unlike their left. Thus a man who on one side was a mild civilian blossomed out on the other as a soldier. A veritable burglar was unmasked as drunkard, and a bishop as a ragamuffin. The chief value of the present works is to obviously give insight to the German costume, armor, and arms, as well as the 16th century social condition. So again, here you can see something about the social condition. We're talking about cowpox here. And so we don't normally think about that because we don't suffer from cowpox now, but it was important enough that they included it here. This is one of the few drawings that I have seen, drawings, paintings, whatever you want to call they are, with a pair. So if you look closely, there are 8 feet there. And this particular setup is not uncommon. You notice that the sleighs are attached very close to the bottom on the runners, right? So there's no room for single trees or anything else. So there's actually 2 sets of shafts here. One shaft is on this outside runner. It goes to the middle, it's attached there, and that is one horse. There's right where the inside shaft is another one that goes to the outside horse, and then his shaft is attached to the outside runner. The sled is much wider than the others, and I'm not quite sure why. It seems to have something to do with nature, but I've not seen anything telling me exactly why. However, it is the only drawing that I have seen with the pair, which is important. So well worth taking a look at. It's at the end of our period. So some people tend to forget this particular book, but I do think it's worth looking at. Again, tails are tied up, nice line of draft, or decent line of draft. Typically we want it to stay above those hocks, but it is a drawing. And then nice line from the driver's hands to the horse's mouth. We can also, yes, we're not entirely sure, but the horse appears to have shoes on and he appears to have heel calks. So again, thinking about traction, those type of things. Going into this particular image, this was one that we were talking about on Horsey Hema the other day. And this particular one has to do with agriculture. We see the rooster up at the top. We see the beekeeping and various instruments for threshing. So one of the things that's very interesting here is this collar. This is the first time we see this type of collar. We still use this type of collar today. In agriculture use, this is an adjustable collar. These are metal prongs that can go in at different spots. And so you can use a taller horse or a shorter horse or whatever you need to do to get that line of draft correct. It's also the first drawing that we see where the traces split. So it's going back to this whole idea of being able to be a workhorse, that type of thing. And so it's redirecting how that weight is hitting the collar. It may be in part because of this horse's conformation. It's hard to tell. The neck seems to be a little bowed, but it's a drawing. It's hard to tell sometimes. And then he also has his feathers up here. He appears to have a noseband. Not entirely sure, but I think that this is the only one in the whole book that has a noseband. So it's definitely worth taking a look at. You can see these at the Met digitally. They're all up there. And I just don't think we take enough time to look at them. This is also the only paint horse that I have seen, which is why we started talking about it on Horse HEMA. There is documentation of painted horses being around. They were in China, they were in India, and they were very popular at one point in time. So if you're really worried about being authentic and whether or not you have a paint horse, don't worry about it. They were around. So I did want to take a few minutes to talk about ring jousting. So back in that 1604 setup that I was talking about earlier, these gentlemen go out and they do ring jousting. It is very established at that point in time. So we can assume that it was happening before 1604. This particular one, when the knightly fighting games in the late Middle Ages changed from male domain to a lighter, playfuler form influenced by Italy, the courtly ladies no longer had to watch from the stands, but became active themselves. Ring piercing, also known as carousel, was extremely popular. The cavaliers steered the sleighs in which the ladies armed with lances sat on predetermined tracks. At a fast pace, they tried to get hold of rings hung on ropes. It could also be wreaths or figures, and if the going was good, there were even sausage rings to be won, which were later consumed at the table. So if you decide that you want to play a game, a medieval type game, while you're sleighing, this is a good option. We've done it before. It takes practice. I do have some video here for you. We'll talk about that in just one second. This is a closer look at what some of those sleighs are. You can really get a sense in this one how big the actual sleigh is and what those collars look like. These are, I sometimes wonder about these particular lances. There are, depending on what country you are in, there's a lot of difference about who was jousting at the rings and what exactly was happening. Italy, it tends to be the ladies. France, it tends to be young men that aren't quite old enough yet to joust. And then when you look at these lances, if this is correct, which there's always the question if this is correct, that's not being held by somebody that's weak. So, we don't know. It is important to note that the ring work is done by the person who is sitting in the vehicle and not the driver. So just do be aware of that. So this is a little video. We'll see if it starts in the right spot. Nope. These sleighs are not significantly different from what we just looked at. And in just a second, they're going to start jousting. There we go. Maureen, this big red horse probably reminds you of Red. There she goes. She got that one.
They're doing that from a sitting position. That'd be hard.
They are. It's as a driver. I mean, I've done it with the whip, but I don't think a novice driver should do it with a whip. I think you have to have it done by a passenger. But I think at the same time, why could you not do this with a carriage? And this is a judge of how good your driver's skill is, because if your driver doesn't line you up right, you got very little chance of getting this. So this horse is kind of like whoop, all over the place, and then okay, we got it. And then they got the yeah.
Ja, wie weet. Wie weet. Ja, die heeft toch ook wel, hè? Maar ik vind het wel leuk om er een beetje bij betrokken te zijn. Ik ga nog steeds graag naar de koers of zo. Als iemand te helpen, dat kan ook.
So I thought that was fun. It took me a long time to find this video, and I was really happy when I did.
I feel like I would have wanted to be on my knees or so doing that. Sitting and doing this seems almost impossible. I think if you could kneel, it would be so much easier. And it's all left-handed, I think.
Yes.
Or
it's all right-handed.
Is it right-handed?
It would have to be.
I don't know. The ones I see more the left
so this
hand
is
up.
That's right-handed.
That is right hand. Sorry, I'm sitting. Okay.
Yep, that's okay.
Long day.
But yeah, but you know, we as human beings get our head wrapped around what is hard and isn't, and then we make decisions about it. If the only way you ever saw this done was by sitting like this, you wouldn't really worry about it. And I think that kneeling would give you a little bit better base, but I can also see where when it's cold out, you have all those layers on and you're underneath the blanket or whatever, you're not going to be able to kneel, I don't think, or bend easily.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So I did want to talk about this for just a minute. I was so proud of myself when I found this. We often talk about what happens at court and, you know, how the royalty would come in and different things would happen. I found this in a German book. I am not entirely sure what time period this is related to. It doesn't have a date with the picture, and I have not yet been able to translate. So I think that this is early 1700s, but we know that they were doing this with carriages much earlier. So I don't think that this would be out of place to use it as an example of what could have been happening during SCA time periods. There is another one as well. And this one here. So clearly, you know, royalty was being able to take these sleighs out. You know, common people use these on a regular basis, like we talked about earlier. If you were sick or injured, you could be taken out in a sled. The same thing was true with the dead or dying. There is a paper that was written on sleds and sledges in Russian funerals, I think is what the name of it was. And it's quite interesting how they would transport bodies and how long things would stay there, et cetera, et cetera. It's also interesting as we go through, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but these get taller. So as our ability to make the pillars that make sleighs stand up, or, you know, and be able to support them gets better, we go from, you know, the Osberg sledges, which were a little tall, not very tall, but a little tall. And then we go down and it's pretty close to the ground. And then we kind of get ourselves back up again. And part of that has to do, it got cold again. As we are leaving SCA time, it's starting to get very cold. And
hey, no stretching ahead. Bernie. Oh.
We are using more and more sleds and things to get around. And so we've decided that we're not going to get snow in our faces. It's not necessary anymore. We have people that actually make these. It's just not the farmer out in his backyard cutting down a tree and putting a set of runners on it so that he can move something. And that, you know, if I have a little bit of wealth and I have nice stuff, I'm not going to want snow and slush and whatever else is in the ground to be cast up on me. And so they begin to learn how to raise these up a little bit. Which then, of course, when you raise the center of gravity, you get the whole idea of whether or not you can tip something over easier. But those type of things happen. You have to take your pluses and minuses. Now, the other thing that I did want to show you, this is horse related. It is not a sled, a sledge, or a sleigh, but this is a really cool thing that I found out that they used to do with horse bones. And this happened in multiple places. It was very common. They would take the jaw bones of horses' skulls and put a board on them, and little kids would scoot down ice on them with little sticks, propel themselves along, and they would also take the bones and make ice skates out of them. And apparently horse bones are particularly well suited to this. And when you think about it, you could see how a jawbone would work for that. But I had never seen that before. I thought that was quite interesting. And so I thought, well, we'll go ahead and find out and see what everybody thinks. So I do see now that we have some questions. So are these designs functional or decorative with just the collar being functional? They are decorative. They're symbolic. Typically speaking, they represent that you have money. And they're also symbols of masculinity, of success, of proudness, those type of things, which is the antlers. I saw a set that are in Norway, and they come off and they're dragon heads. I desperately want to make them. I've not been very good at my wood carving, but that was my goal when I started wood carving, was to be able to make them. And they're all symbols of success. And some of them are incredibly beautiful. But it's no different than when we were parading horses through Central Park, or even now when we do a Concours de l'Elegance. It's about being seen, and being seen as having too much money.
Kathleen,
Yes.
one question, that question was in regards to all those pretty pictures of the either harness design or barding design way back.
Okay, so yeah, I mean,
with all the swirlies and stuff, I didn't know if those.
Yeah, no, so this particular one is just design.
Okay.
You don't need it. Because I'm sorry, I was thinking about the collars, because I'm all about those collars. But you'll notice as we go through, let me go back here. You can clearly see, again, well, it's still about being seen and everything, but because those bells are very expensive, the more bells you have, the more prestige you have. And in a lot of cases, bells were required. You had to have some sort of bells. And I'm not quite sure how loud these ones were. Once you get into the Sun King's court and things like that, silver bells that are bigger come into favor, and there's some things that come into play there about being seen that have to do with money, very much so. But I'm not so sure about the bells. I think they're very practical. I think they're smaller. I've not seen a set of barding that survived from this era, and so that had bells on. So I'm not sure quite how big they are. This is one of the few drawings where the barding is on the outside of the, these are either, in some cases, they are leather traces, but here they're wooden shafts that go up. And the shafts are decorated to match everything else, but this is one of the very few where it's on the outside. The boxes of the sledges seem fairly small, one-person occupation. Yeah, so that is an interesting question. They definitely were made, well, people were smaller. They definitely seem to be the case where a lot of women rode in them, or young kids, like we at the very beginning, where they were kind of strapped in. And that was certainly true. For in a lot of cases, the man sat on the back. And as we go through periods right after this in the 1700s, particularly in Russia, which I was just looking at, it was not seen to be manly to be inside and out of the elements, which I'm like, that just proves that you're stupid. But who wouldn't want to be out of the elements? But it was a manly thing, and masculinity apparently keeps you from freezing when you're outside in the elements, and that's just part of their thing. So yeah, lots of fun with the bells and that type of thing. Yeah, so those, if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I did want to just talk just a minute about some resources that we have available to us. And I think I had one more slide back here. So we really like that. Yeah. So if you're were able to come with us to the first symposium that we had 2 years ago. We had it here in Lexington, Kentucky at the home, and the Carriage Association of America let us use their building, which is actually where I am right now. In this area, we have the Carriage Museum of America, which the name is a little deceptive because they do not have a museum. They actually curate a library that is partially theirs and partially ours. It has a little over 2,000 books on driving in it. You can access that, I believe, at carriagelibrary.com. It is the Carriage Museum of America. They are in the process of getting all of their books digitalized that we have the rights to. There are some that we don't. But we're very fortunate in that, you know, we do have books like this, Sledges and Wheeled Vehicles. I found this particular one very helpful. This is Osta's book. It is available. It's one of the very few that's still for sale. It runs $24.95. We have it here. You can buy it anywhere you like, but just so you know, this book here, which is the wagon book with George Cruller. This has a lot more on vehicles in it, but there are some wonderful photos here of some sleighs. And this is where I found that drawing from the courts. And so if you're into that type of thing, they have a lot. It's a slow process being able to translate this thing, but they have a lot of things in here that happened right at the turn of the 1700s. We're also very fortunate, this does not leave, but this is Henrik Kreiser's Wagons and Sledges book. And he is considered an expert on this type of research. Again, it's all in German, but the photos in here are just absolutely wonderful. I didn't use very many of them because we do have them, they are digitalized, but just fantastic. If you ever get a chance to look at one, do so. He has, like this one, you're not going to be able to see this very well, but if you can see this collar that's down here, it looks like it has horns. That's actually the moon. Can you imagine? So there are lots of really beautiful things in here that are just worth looking at. It is a relatively rare book, but if you ever come to Lexington, Kentucky, make an appointment and they can help you at the Carriage, the CMA, or you can contact us at the Carriage Museum of America. Carriage Association of America. Andre Sfuger has a book, or it's not a book, it's 58 pages the Swiss National Museum Sledges in the European Context, which is available on academic.edu, I believe. And that is also a lovely just piece of information to read. I think that Rachel is off here right now. She was here earlier, but I think she's heard him speak. He comes to our International Carriage Symposium sometimes and talks. I did just hear from Darren, who is coming in next.
Kathleen, I am still here.
Oh, are you? Oh, okay. I couldn't see you earlier. Yeah, so Darren just texted and he said he's on his way in. So, but yeah, did you ever hear Andre speak at the symposium?
Oh, I'm just trying to, I can't remember. What was her presentation again?
His would have been, well, I don't know. I know he comes sometime. I know right now he's on the Bugatti, and how they the carriage company transformed into the car company, and
oh yeah, that was a great presentation. That was absolutely wonderful. Sorry, I'm a horrible person with names.
Mario did the one that was last year, but he's done. I think Andres has done this before. But anyways, they're very good researchers. Is my point. And in general, very nice people. Usually, if if I need to contact them and ask them something, they're very willing. He emailed me this weekend because he was very sad that he wasn't able to help me with something. Okay. And how stiff would these big collars be? They're not particularly stiff. They are well stuffed. Actually, you may remember last year for my A&S project, well, actually, I guess that would have been 2019. I made some collars, and they were stuffed for the most part with straw and grasses, but they were tightly stuffed. So they would have been shaped to fit the actual horse's shoulders, a little bit more so than what we do right now. But they're actually pretty lightweight, realistically. So